Well, presently, I'm senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. And we work in the national security community, but we're not part of the government. We don't take money from the government, and we certainly don't from any foreign government, which is why we're so small. But my roots were actually I wanted to go into the CIA when I was a kid, and realized early on that it was not for me. It was a bureaucracy. It was really stringent, and for independent-minded people, that's not the place for you to be. So, but I did work on the periphery in the Reagan years, during Reagan's first term, fighting the communists abroad. So I was working with the Contras in Nicaragua with a foreign insurgency. I was working with political organizations abroad to defeat left-wing movements abroad, and then infiltrating Soviet International Front organizations to disrupt the international communist movement, and then the liberals and lefties who were in their orbit. So I've had my feet into that community, but I was never part of it. They have a lot of influence over policy, not only with the ideas that they develop and the programs and policies that they develop, but they developed ways of thinking, worldviews. How do you think as a congressional staffer, or as a journalist, or a professor, or an intelligence analyst? They shape all that thinking, and we need that because people working inside the government are just too busy to learn. You can't you do keep learning on the job, but you really have to have somebody helping to orient you, and then have a forum where you can discuss with other professionals, people from other backgrounds and even from other countries. So that's normal. When it becomes a problem is when they're taking money from the central government and people don't know it.
Yeah.
So, for example, RAND was funded with U.S. Air Force funding. Everybody knew it. It was supposed to be a government think tank where people can do the deep dive stuff so that we can learn how to defend ourselves. That's one thing. But you get to a place like Brookings, which takes a lot of foreign money from communist China,
Right.
from the Emir of Qatar,
Right.
hottest dictator, and so forth, and it's hidden. So they will develop a policy that our diplomats, without having to declare that they're foreign funded, because as a tax-exempt educational organization, you don't have to follow the Foreign Agents Registration Act, because the law was designed to cut out those institutions. So this is how these foreign agents can operate, and also foreign intelligence services and our own intelligence services. Yeah, and shadows of other people's governments too.
Right.
So the 501c3 law, that's the section of the IRS code, is for nonprofit educational foundations. So they do have to report where the money's coming from to a degree, but it's really easy to camouflage it. So say the Chinese Communist Party can run their money through an American company, which then makes a charitable contribution. Let's say they give $1 million. So that means that on their when they pay their taxes, they can reduce that $1 million from their profit, and they're not taxed on it.
Yeah. And
but the 501c4s, that's the next section of the IRS code, is also a nonprofit. So you're not taxed because you can't make a profit, but so you can pay yourself $1 million a year, and then that's a profit that your foundation's not making. They do not have to disclose where their money is coming from. So that's part of the dark money network. Or it's criminal incompetence. Imagine, we're still, for the time being, the most powerful country in the world. We're the most important democracy in the world. Other countries would be fools not to exploit our open system and not to exploit the differences among us to influence the way our elections turn out to their benefits, whether it's the Russians, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the British. It doesn't matter who, whether it's the Venezuelan cartels. Somebody has an interest always in determining who's elected in our country. George Washington warned about this in his farewell address. About the insidious wiles of foreign influence and the pretended patriots. He was warning about this since day one. So for our intelligence services to say flat out that their assessment is that no foreign power is trying to manipulate our election process is either criminal negligence, incompetence, or a lie. It's really strange. So I'm speaking not as a techie, but as a political warfare person who has been active in these kinds of things before this kind of technology existed. But if you look at what Smartmatic was, it was founded by Venezuelans and by naturalized Americans from Venezuela to develop software and machine systems for the running of democratic elections and tabulating their results.
Right.
So they like to say, well, we're a Delaware company or we're a Florida company. Yeah, but look at all the offshore shell companies they have. Now they're a British company, but the Barbados, Curacao, I mean, you name it.
Right.
They funded initially, their biggest first client, their main first client was the Hugo Chavez government of Venezuela, which paid their group $91 million 20 years ago to run the elections. There was a recall referendum to get rid of Hugo Chavez, and Chavez knew he was going to lose. So he said, develop me a system so that I can win my election and that nobody will figure it out. And so that's how Smartmatic developed. It branded itself as the most trusted, most secure name in election security. It bought up American and other election service companies. And see, we're at a disadvantage in America because by design, we don't have a centralized voting system. So until now, the central government doesn't control our voting system. It's all towns, counties, cities, and states. What they're trying to do is to break through that, to impose under you have diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now there's an A on the end called accessibility. And what that accessibility is, in part, is to require everybody to vote electronically through a small number of vendors. Many of those vendors are using the software developed by Smartmatic, whose source code was paid for by the Venezuelan regime to install a dictatorship by democratic means.
It's shocking stuff. And then
with the Cuban intelligence service over their shoulder advising them what to do, and the Chinese out there providing other resources to make it work right. Right, so when you see a company out there, let's say a tech company or a company that's involved in the political process, and they claim to be trusted and open, but they won't let their source code be put up for independent audit and examination. So the source code is the electronic DNA of software. So the software can change or whatever, but the source code has a basic nature to it like DNA does, or like a virus does. Right. It can mutate, it can change over time, but it's still the same thing. And so what it can do, if it's created the right way, it will create trapdoors in the systems so that the systems can look like they're operating fine, but they can be manipulated by somebody who has the access to the source code. So none of the American software of any consequence used in our elections is open source. So it's not like people can come in and troubleshoot it. It's all trade secrets because they're all competing among themselves, but there isn't a single election authority in the United States that requires a thorough independent audit of the source code. The last one I know of was California under Governor Schwarzenegger in 2007. And they took the software and said, this is a problem. This is fundamentally flawed. It's subject to every kind of manipulation. We're going to decertify it for the state of California.
Wow.
Jerry Brown came in and repealed the need to certify the software. And then Gavin Newsom comes in and says, we don't, basically anybody can vote, whatever, because it's California. So there is no independent certification of this. And then because it's under so many different names, and because as some software people say, it's like a song that's a different song, but it's the same melody.
Right.
So you can go along with the song, you put different words and different whatever else. So this is what's running our system through different brands and different companies, all foreign based.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like it's, you know how a lot of things can happen just because they do and fall together. And it's not really necessarily by centralized design or control. It's people who have similar agendas or who can profit off somebody else's agenda. And everything just dovetails together naturally. But the thing is, they all have a similar worldview. They were educated in the same place, or they have the same social circles or whatever. So there's a conduct there, sort of an unwritten conduct code that, I'm going to go along with that, or I'll go and do that. And then when there's so much cash involved, there's been so many cases of suspected bribery and actual bribery and other forms of corruption that people are just going to go along. But then what happens? Where is the central control?
Right.
This is where you have a dictatorship like Venezuela saying, we need to have a democratic process. We need all the citizens to buy into that process, to trust that process. and then to vote in ways that we will then manipulate behind the scenes. That means everyone is a participant in the fraudulent process, even if they don't want to be, and even if they know it's a fraud.
Wow.
That's one thing. So you have a central regime doing this, paying a private company to do it. Now you have the intelligence services of Cuba, which now, we underestimate the Cubans because it's basically a snobbish, even a bigoted attitude, or they're just Cubans. What do they know? They have got some of the best intelligence services on the planet. Given their size, they're punching way above their weight. They did it for the Soviets. The only people to outdo them were the East Germans, the Stasi. So the Stasi and the Cubans were the only intelligence services who routinely turned all of the agents we sent against them. The Russians could never do that. The Chinese couldn't even do that. So I've got a lot of respect for those Cuban bad guys. Where do they get their money from?
Right.
They get their money from drug cartels, and they get their money from Venezuelan oil. So you've got symbiosis now. So the Cubans sell out their intelligence services to the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Venezuelans, other bad guys. But it's not that they're just corrupting liberal left-wingers like, say, Karen Bass, mayor of Los Angeles, former congresswoman. She's been working for them. Odd guys like Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security. He's about my age. People of this generation who came from Cuba, as he did as an infant, are hardcore anti-communists, but not Mayorkas. He's been working with the Cuban communists. Now, very atypical of Cuban emigres. You gotta wonder why.
Yeah. I mean, we all remember Barack Obama going to the baseball game with the Castros. So excited.
Yep. Yeah. And then that limp wrist thing he had with Raul Castro.
Right.
Fidel's brother. But now look, they're not just infiltrating liberals and lefties. They've burrowed into the Republican side and the conservative side too, to water things down. Not saying, well, we're a bunch of Marxists, come along with us. They're just coming in with business opportunities.
Right.
Coming out of Texas, Florida, and elsewhere. Tone down your rhetoric. Look the other way on this, and then they'll have a diversion to look someplace else or make money on this. So there's lots of ways to co-opt all of us. So if they're doing that in normal American politics, why wouldn't they be doing that with our electronic voting systems? Well, on the one hand, it's easy to look at California and say, those people are all nuts. What do we expect from that? But California wasn't always nuts. There are different cultures within California, but if you look, any politician coming out of San Francisco, like Gavin Newsom did when he was mayor, you automatically have to question, what do the Chinese have on them?
Exactly. Yeah. Because
working in San Francisco more than any other city, but they're not just recruiting and going after people once they're famous and once they're elected to high office.
Right.
They get them at the local politician level as a ward member or a city council member. And you saw this with a certain congressman and his little Fang. She caught him when he was a council member. So they get them while they're young and then cultivate them and raise them and fund them and reward them and penalize their adversaries so that when they become up on the national level, they're completely owned subsidiaries of the Chinese Communist Party. It's everywhere. Where did the founders of Black Lives Matter get their money?
Right, exactly.
Remember their trip to Venezuela? And
yes.
Wound them all up. So the whole Congressional Black Caucus itself since the 70s has been tied with the Cuban regime.
Wow, yes.
Look at Congresswoman Barbara Lee from Oakland, California. She was a congressional staffer working for Congressman Ron Dellums to investigate the airstrip that was being built in the little Caribbean island of Grenada that Reagan was saying was going to be a Soviet airstrip, which it was. It could accommodate any Soviet bomber or reconnaissance aircraft. So you do a triangulation: Cuba, Grenada down by Venezuela, Nicaragua to the east. That's a triangle over the entire Caribbean, meaning all our trade through Panama, everything coming out of New Orleans and the Mississippi area ports, Florida and everything. And she came back with that report for the House Armed Services Committee and said, it's just for tourism. Well, then we looked at when the U.S. forces went in, confiscated the whole Grenada government archives. They sent the draft of that congressional report to the communist regime for its editing and approval before it was submitted as a House Armed Services Committee official report on the Subcommittee on Military Construction. And it gets even better, because back when I was a kid infiltrating Communist International Front organizations, I was in Europe. We were there to disrupt a $50 million Soviet active measures operation. And over there, people address themselves as comrade if they know the person is a Communist Party member of their own country, and if they themselves are a Communist Party member of their own country. And there was that congressional staffer there, Barbara Lee,
No
calling
way.
everyone comrade so-and-so. They
Unbelievable.
were calling her comrade. I saw it with my own eyes. Yeah, well, yeah. So just think, this is a canal that we built
Right.
so that we could be a world power through that canal, going through that from
Right.
Atlantic to Pacific. So much trade goes through that canal, but warships can go through the canal as the right of innocent passage under maritime law. So it's vital, but it's really easy to shut down. And so when the United States surrendered the Panama Canal to return it back to Panama, because that was sovereign American territory, the Canal Zone. That's why when John McCain was born in Panama, he could still run for president because he was born in the Canal Zone, which was part of Uncle Sam. So Carter gave it away. The Republicans went along with it. I went down there in 1999 to investigate reports that the Chinese were coming in to take over both ends of the canal as the U.S. was shutting down its military presence. They were buying up former U.S. military sites on both ends of the canal. This was through Hutchison Whampoa, which was a Hong Kong company. Yeah, it was a British company based in Hong Kong, run by the Chinese Communist Party, and they were taking up, and they were even taking up the Taiwanese-owned port facilities at one end of the Panama Canal, the Evergreen facilities. This was 25 years ago. I wrote about it. The Senate had hearings about it. They brought in even the Panama Canal transition experts, the head of the U.S. Southern Command, all these other people asking the question, are the Chinese taking over the canal? And everyone said, I don't know. Oh, they do it by saying, well, it's a Hong Kong company. It's really not Chinese. Or, well, yeah, it is Chinese, but we have safeguards. We can take it back whenever we want to. Or all of these different excuses. And then they'll come in and they'll have some, say Rhino Republican come in and say, look, I'm a defense hawk. I'm a good Republican. I swear to you, the Chinese are not going to control the port. They just own the rights to it.
Oh my!
Yeah, and then or it's done through a British front or a offshore front, and there'll always be local politicians will want it, the unions will want it in general because those ports will give incentives to those unions. You kind of wonder, why does the head of the International Longshoremen's Union have $1 million a year compensation package and a 70-foot yacht while he's threatening to take down the country?
Right.
So you've got to wonder why. Now, if you look at the history of the Longshoremen's Union, they were collaborating with Soviet active measures operations for decades anyway, because they were controlling so much of our infrastructure. Don't know if they still are, but we do have to ask the questions. And look at who's being blamed, though. It's not the erudite, suit-wearing, reception-going Washington think tank people with their PBS and CNN counterparts and their, it's not that. It's real Americans. Yeah. What kind of Americans? People from flyover country, deplorables. So people who aren't that glib and don't speak in such fancy tones and have those big academic degrees. Those are the ones who are being villainized.
Yes.
And so any political leader who helps advance their cause and identifies with them will also be villainized. And then those political leaders link up with other populist political leaders. Let's say, look at the ones across Europe. So, Nigel Farage of the United Kingdom and the
Orban.
Orban. So Orban's totally a Russian tool, right? Because he wants to save his culture. Yes, he wants to be part of NATO. He wants to be part of the Western Alliance. He even wants to be part of the EU, but he doesn't want to have a rainbow republic imposed on destroying everything that was the Hungarian people worked so hard to revive after communism. So who's there saying, hey, I'm not going to, rainbow flag you to death? It's Putin. What dilemma are you being put in now as a country? And frankly, who's the worst enemy? Someone who's trying to destroy our culture from within and start a civil war against us through censorship and surveillance and all these other controls, or a foreign adversary with thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at us?
Right. I mean,
so and look at Finland is heading in this direction even now. Poland is off and on. Even France and the Netherlands and Denmark and Who would have ever thought the Swedes and the Norwegians would start deporting illegal aliens? So there's a big backlash going on to this.
Yeah.
It's all, of course, racist, and it's all
Right, I know.
So when you get back to demonizing us, this is another thing we have to think about as Americans is the whole world is looking at us, and like it or not, it does matter what much of the world thinks about us because we're a country that depends on international trade.
Right.
So we have to be not demonizing other countries, but yes, demonizing other forces. So like Trump said in his Warsaw speech back when he was president, he was encouraging all countries to act in their own interests for their own people and not for some globalist force.
Right.
Then we can come together and identify in our own sovereign interests the way normal human relations are, where yes, we're charitable toward others, but first we have to be charitable to ourselves and our families and our friends. And so, but in doing that, we're going to find a commonality of interests where we can all have find peaceful, prosperous, transactional relationships. The very powerful argument that the globalists are trying to demonize. Well, so the USAID, the Agency for International Development, was developed by President Kennedy as a way of fighting Soviet expansionism and communist revolution and even socialism by alleviating poverty and educating people in poor countries, bringing in running water and fighting disease and that kind of thing. So it had a noble humanitarian beginning and a geopolitical beginning because it was an instrument to contain communism.
Right.
Well, that became a development industrial complex of its own. So when you have, let's say, $100 million going to a NGO, private NGO, as a contractor for USAID, so they're running some humanitarian program. If you break down that budget, you look at the salaries these people make. You look at the political donations that they make.
Right.
You look at the subcontracting. So that $100 million, probably only 10% of it is going to go to its original cause because of all the different layers of bureaucracy and employment and other largesse. And then you've got to sort of pay off the locals, which is kind of understood. It's a form of tax, really. It's an efficiency tax. But so it's become an industrial complex of its own.
Yeah.
No. It's funding political movements. It's pushing the DEI critical Marxist agenda on countries that resent it and hate it. So instead of being a way for other countries to not side with our adversaries,
right, exactly,
because we're helping them fight disease or bring in clean water, it is alienating them to the point where they want nothing to do with us, but they won't kick us out because there's so much of our cash going in that they're profiting from it. So you go to West Africa.
Right.
I spent a little bit of time in Nigeria a few years ago, and I was really pleasantly shocked, but pleasantly surprised to see the huge amount of support for Donald Trump in Nigeria.
Right.
He was the man. They love the man. They love that big man stuff. And you get Nigerians, especially the Christian Nigerians, a lot of Catholic and Protestant Nigerians, evangelicals in the South. They're hardcore. Yeah. They're old school. I mean, they still do Latin Mass in Nigeria.
Right.
It's supposed to be a Western imperialist offensive thing. They know right from wrong, and they're really tough about it. They really resent us, and they laugh at us now because of all this rainbow flaggery and other stuff that's going on that's trying to destroy their traditional societies. Oh, and Mel, you had referred to that Office of the Director of National Intelligence analyses, analyses, if they call it, 1 and 2 pagers, going back to July, saying that they don't see any foreign attempts to manipulate the process of our elections. It might be, they're doing some AI imagery, or they're planting some stories, or hacking emails and leaking them. But that's Bush League stuff compared to what's really happening. Right. So they're finding no threats like, say, a Venezuelan software in our systems.
Right.
Now,
Or
but
Iranians supposedly stealing Trump's documents and then giving them to the Harris campaign, and it went
yeah.
in and out of the news overnight.
Yeah, well, yeah, and they did report that, but you know what, Bill? That's to be expected. First, that's part of politics, but that's part of good spycraft. Of course,
Right, that's their
the other
job.
guy's stuff, and you try to sow divisions. That's normal. I mean, we have to be fighting it and exposing it, but we shouldn't be shocked by it. But here's what one of those reports said that you just cited. It said that people who allege foreign attempts to manipulate our elections and foreign attempts to sow discord in our country. You can't sow discord if none exists in the first place, right? But they're saying those, so meaning what they're boiling it down to is Americans who allege these things are probably tools of the Russians and the Chinese and Iranians. Yeah, yeah. Of course, what they're doing is they're doing exactly what they would have condemned, say, third world countries from doing 50
Exactly.
years ago. They're building a one-party technocratic administrative state. So they want to do it by rigging elections, by however they can, by buying off a token opposition, by stacking the judiciary branch, by using prosecutors as political weapons. This is all banana republic stuff, but it's done in a very sophisticated way. And there's a ton of money in it because why? There aren't enough lawyers in the Justice Department. So what does the Justice Department do? It contracts out to these big, expensive law firms at places like where Eric Holder makes his millions.
Right.
So they're just divvying up the world for themselves. And they had no problem with Russian collusion when Hillary was selling our uranium to Putin. Multiple communities, multiple credentials, multiple networks. So now they know who to call to get something done.
Right.
So it's not always centrally controlled. It's, hey, who do you know? Hey, I know this person. Well, let's call this and let's have an event there. And then it looks like a lot of different voices with the same message. But I want to say something about Brookings because you've raised it a few times. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest think tank in Washington. And one of the things that think tanks do is they take people who have not served in government and they credential them and they network them so that they can be put in places of government. And then they'll have a whole outside network of specialized communities to draw on to advance policies. They then leave government after their credential and they move back to the think tank where they can live. So, meaning you can go in, you can make decisions, and you know you have a job when you get out of government. Conservatives don't act that way. So they have that. But Brookings itself, for years, was headed by a man named Strobe Talbott. Strobe Talbott was a Time magazine reporter in his 20s, in the 1970s. And he got, as a 20-something, he got the notes and personal recordings of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And he became a world-famous journalist by putting out a book called Khrushchev Remembers, which at the time was a huge, huge, huge deal. Now, where did he get those? He got them from a man named Victor Louis, a Soviet, quote, journalist. He was actually a KGB officer whose job was to spot and cultivate and recruit foreign journalists, make them famous, make them a lot of money, and then give them that coveted Kremlin access so they'd have access to all these special stories. And then they became noted around the world as the expert on this. This was Strobe Talbott. That's how he was built. He was Bill Clinton's roommate at Oxford.
Wow. Oh, wow. Well, that makes a lot more sense now.
So when Clinton becomes president, right after the Soviet collapse, and there's this whole mess there, and yes, it is in our interest to help Russia get back on its feet because it has all these nukes aimed at us. What can we do to help stabilize the country and bring in business, stabilize the economy? It made sense. But what did he do? He put Strobe Talbott in charge of our policy toward the former Soviet Union.
Oh, wow.
When he came up for his Deputy Secretary of State confirmation hearings with Jesse Helms, good old Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, I wrote the questions for Senator Helms to ask Talbott. And Talbott's always very smug and glib and knows everything more than all these senators, supremely self-confident. And then Senator Helms starts asking him about Victor Louis and his ties with the KGB and Talbott's ties with the KGB. Talbot suddenly gets all nervous. His hands are like this. He's fidgety. Who comes to the rescue to ask for a break? Senator John Kerry. Yeah, well, there's a lot there. I mean,
Yeah.
and I see and understand perfectly why so many people think the way they do about Bill Barr and Mike Pompeo. But at the same time, Mike Pompeo was in the CIA a very short time.
Right.
Did a lousy job. He did a lousy job because he didn't bring in a political deputy beneath him who knew the CIA and could be his Sherpa to take him all around the bureaucracy and to fight the bureaucratic battles that are necessary. Instead, he brought in a very wily intelligence officer who was based in London for many years. And then she ran the CIA while he was going around the world doing a tour of different CIA stations that we have worldwide. She was running the CIA, Gina Haspel. And then Pompeo, to his discredit, suggested to Trump that he name her to run the CIA when he became Secretary of State. I think he was a fine Secretary of State, but a crummy CIA director. And he allowed the CIA to run itself. Well, here's one of the problems is they see how the president was last time, where he didn't have a strategy. He had terrible personnel instincts in many ways. He didn't come in with a team. And so why are you going to sacrifice your life and have to lawyer up and ruin everything just because you're going to be put into a team and then get thrown to the wolves?
Right. Yeah.
Now, Trump has learned from that, and this time he and other groups are helping vet people and put together teams for him, like Heritage is doing it. America First Policy, FBI is doing a great job doing it. And so those teams are being put together now. And so there are some people who should never be, they're listed. They should never be in any position at all.
Right. Dangerous
ones who had served in the previous administration. And then others, including people who were still unknown or not public figures, and not the political sycophant hacks who hang around West Palm Beach to try to get, a pat on the head and a thumbs up photo. Well, the book is titled Big Intel, How the CIA and FBI Went from Cold War Heroes to Deep State Villains. The best place to get it is Amazon. It's the cheapest there. Amazon's not canceling me, and you get it audio and ebook as well. Cool. Don't bother at Barnes & Noble because they charge a lot more, and they have canceled Big Intel from their stores. They made the corporate decision. They made the corporate decision to cancel the book. You can get it in some stores, but it's up to different managers. But you're going to pay $10 more than you would on Amazon.
That's so insane. You've been in the intel business for 50 years. What?
It's also banned at the International Spy Museum. Oh, and there's a former CIA analyst, John Gentry, who has a book out called Neutering Intelligence. It's a very scholarly book, but it's all about how anti-Trump bias in the CIA blinds people to be blind to the threats that we have and to be chasing threats that don't exist. So career CIA man, his book was banned from the Spy Museum. The curator of the museum said so because we tried to go to rent space at our own expense to do a joint book promotion.
Oh my!
And the museum said, "You're not welcome here."
Okay, well,
John Gentry found eight of the 51 spies who lied. Remember in that letter saying 8 of them are on different boards of the Spy Museum.